Your brain produces monthly a substance that the Vatican calls holy crism in secret rituals. You waste it without knowing.
Christos was never a proper name. In Greek, it literally means oil.
The same precious oil that your pineal and pituitary glands secrete when the moon crosses the degree of your birth. Carey exposed in his book, God, Man, the Word Made Flesh, preserve this secretion for 72 hours without alcohol, and it rises through the spine, explodes in potency in the brain, and produces the state they sell as salvation through Jesus. Golgotha means place of the skull, and it's not a hill in Jerusalem. It's the base of your skull where the optic nerves cross. The bread and wine of communion, metaphors for this sacred secretion from your body, which they replaced with crackers and juice. Constantine, who boiled his own wife, changed the original lunar calendar. Result, you never get the timing of your sacred cycles right. While popes fast during the correct lunar periods, you pay tithes, thinking you need a priest to talk to God. The illumination you beg for on your knees is being produced right now in your head.
For 1,700 years, billions of human beings have knelt before altars, drunk sacramental wine, and eaten wheat wafers, believing that these external rituals would guarantee their eternal salvation. All of them were deceived. The substance they sought outside of themselves circulates at this exact moment through your spinal cord, and you will probably waste it today, as you did yesterday, as you will tomorrow. In 1918, an American physician and biochemist named George Washington Carey published a text that should have shaken the foundations of institutionalized Christianity. The document, titled The Antichrist, did not attack any religious figure. On the contrary, it revealed that the very concept of Christ had been deliberately inverted, transformed from an internal biochemical process into an external historical narrative. Carey was not a delusional mystic or a rebellious theologian. He was a researcher who had dedicated decades to the comparative study of ancient texts, human anatomy, and esoteric traditions preserved by secret communities. What Carey discovered fundamentally challenges the way Western civilization has understood spirituality for nearly 2 millennia. According to his research, corroborated by fragments of knowledge preserved by the Essenes, Gnostics, and medieval alchemists, Christ is not and never was a person. The Greek word Christos literally means oil or ointment, a physical, measurable secretion that the human body produces in precise lunar cycles. This substance, known to initiates as the sacred oil, descends through the spinal column, starting from specific glands in the brain. The early Christians, those who gathered secretly in the Roman catacombs, making the sign of the fish, knew this secret. They knew that the Hebrew and Greek scriptures constituted elaborate manuals of esoteric anatomy, where each character, each place, and each event described real physiological processes occurring within the temple of the human body. When they read about the River Jordan, they visualized the spinal cord. When they meditated on Bethlehem, the house of bread, they focused on the solar plexus where the Christic seed is born monthly. Golgotha was not a distant hill in Jerusalem, but the human skull itself where crucifixion occurs, not a death, but an energetic amplification of extraordinary proportions. This interpretation does not arise from modern speculations or contemporary conspiracy theories. Carey meticulously documented how this knowledge appears encoded in multiple traditions. In the Egyptian hieroglyphs that describe the Ankh as the key to eternal life, in the Vedic texts that detail the movement of kundalini, and in the alchemical treatises that speak of the distillation of philosophical mercury. All these traditions, separated by thousands of years and miles, describe the same biochemical process using different symbolisms. The question that must be forming in your mind right now is obvious. If this is true, why have you never heard about it before? The answer goes back to the year 325 of the Common Era, when a Roman emperor named Constantine, a man who had murdered his own mother and boiled his wife in oil, convened the Council of Nicaea. For months, bishops who barely understood Greek debated about the nature of Christian symbols. According to Carey, apparently trivial questions revealed the profound ignorance of these leaders. Whether angels possessed wings was decided by only 3 votes of difference. The bishops did not understand that Jacob in Hebrew means heel or circle, referring to the zodiacal cycles, and that the ladder of angels represented the influence of the signs on earth, not a literal physical structure. What emerged from Nicaea was a completely new religion, which voted to transform symbols of the human body into historical characters. The council, dominated by Constantine, established that Jesus was a specific historical man, a political decision that Carey considers totally and indubitably without factual foundation. The internal oil became external wine. The heavenly bread that feeds the nervous system was transformed into processed wheat. Individual monthly regeneration was replaced by weekly collective rituals. And thus, humanity was systematically disconnected from its innate spiritual technology, becoming dependent on institutional intermediaries for something that each human body already possesses and produces naturally. This knowledge remained hidden, preserved only in hermetic circles and secret societies, while billions searched outside of themselves for what had always been within. The moment has come to examine the evidence, understand the mechanism, and decide for yourself whether you will continue kneeling before external altars or learn to work with the sacred alchemy that already operates in your own body. 3 centuries before Constantine, Essene communities preserved manuscripts that interpreted the term Christos as a reference to a physical oil present in the human spinal cord, not as the title of a coming Messiah. These groups maintained libraries where Hebrew texts were annotated with precise instructions. When the scriptures mentioned oil, ointment, or balm, they referred to specific glandular secretions. When they spoke of bread, they pointed to the nervous food produced in the solar plexus. Each metaphor had its documented anatomical correspondence. George Carey discovered that these interpretations were not late mystical fantasies. The original terms themselves revealed their physiological meanings when examined etymologically. Israel, decomposed into Israel, Isis, Ra, and El, 3 aspects of the generating force that the ancients located respectively in the pineal, in the solar plexus, and in the gonads. The 12 tribes of Israel corresponded precisely to the 12 mineral salts that modern biochemistry confirms as essential for each organic function, distributed throughout the body according to the zodiacal influence documented by Paracelsus and other medical alchemists. The Roman conquest of territories around the Mediterranean followed a specific pattern of linguistic suppression that transcended mere political domination. When Rome prohibited Aramaic in Judea, Coptic in Egypt, and Gaulish in Gaul, it eliminated systems where each letter carried numerical and vibrational value. The Hebrew alphabet, for example, functioned simultaneously as a writing system, mathematical code, and map of sound frequencies. The letter Aleph did not just begin words. Its shape represented the union of higher and lower principles. Its numerical value, 1, indicated unity, and its correct pronunciation created specific resonance in the cranial cavity. Ecclesiastical Latin replaced these living languages with a language that was already born dead for initiatic purposes. A priest reciting Hoc est corpus meum would never realize that he should be identifying and cultivating the oily body in himself, not magically transforming wheat bread into divine flesh. The very word sacrament, which in Latin meant military oath, replaced the Greek mysterion, a technical term from the mystery schools where initiates learn to operate the biochemical processes of their organism. Let's take the word sin. The original Greek term hamartia was technical archery vocabulary, to miss the target. The Essenes and Gnostics understood this literally. To waste the monthly seed, to fail to elevate it through the column to the brain, was to miss the target of regeneration. Rome transformed this technical instruction into a concept of moral guilt, creating generations tormented by imaginary transgressions while ignoring the only real waste, that of the regenerative substance their own bodies produced. The geographical allegories of the scriptures mapped the body with medical precision. The River Jordan, which rises from Mount Hermon and descends to the Dead Sea, traced the exact path of the spinal cord from the brain to the sacral plexus. Carey documented how each city mentioned in the sacred texts corresponded to a specific nerve center. Jerusalem was located where modern medicine places the cardiorespiratory complex. Bethlehem, literally house of bread in Hebrew, marked the solar plexus where the nourishing seed forms. Jericho, whose walls fall at the sound of trumpets, represented the resistances of the laryngeal plexus that yield when the correct vocal vibration is achieved. The Red Sea that Moses divides. The Essene anatomists identified it with the circulatory system that must be divided, arterial from venous, through breathing techniques that alter blood chemistry. The 40 years in the desert corresponded to the 40 lunar periods necessary for complete cellular regeneration through conservation of the seed. The manna that feeds the Israelites in the Exodus was the same substance that descends from the brain, heaven, to nourish the nervous system during periods of fasting and conservation. The suppression of this anatomical spiritual knowledge did not happen by accident or ignorance. The records show that entire libraries were burned, not because they contained heresies, but because they preserved the interpretive keys that would make priestly mediation obsolete. A Gnostic text from the 2nd century, preserved at Nag Hammadi, explicitly declares, "Those who say that the Lord died first and then resurrected are mistaken, for he resurrected first and then died," clearly referring to the process of elevating the seed before its death or consumption in the regenerative process. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, was not abstract philosophy. It was operational instruction. Each planetary movement corresponds to a glandular rhythm. Each lunar phase synchronizes with a hormonal cycle, and each solar season activates different metabolic processes. The human body contains, on a microcosmic scale, all the principles and forces of the macrocosmic universe. Know thyself, inscribed at Delphi, literally meant learn your sacred anatomy, master your biochemical processes, and consciously operate the alchemy that already occurs in your organism. But Rome needed dependent subjects, not spiritually self-sufficient individuals. Salvation had to come through the institution, mediated by priests, paid with tithes, guaranteed by obedience. Thus, the internal oil became external wine, the nervous bread became wheat wafer, individual regeneration became collective ritual, and humanity forgot that it carried in each cell the complete technology for its own illumination. The pineal gland, the size of a pea, and the pituitary, no larger than a bean, produce monthly a secretion that George Carey identified as the most precious substance in the human body. This is not a poetic metaphor or religious symbolism. The ancient text describes specific chemical properties: an oily substance, slightly alkaline, with a characteristic odor that varies according to its stage of maturation. The biochemistry laboratories of the early 20th century, where Carey conducted his research, had already identified unusual glandular secretions, but they did not possess the technology to track their complete path through the organism. The process begins with astronomical precision. When the moon transits through the same zodiacal degree that the sun occupied at the moment of the individual's birth, a period of approximately 2.5 days each month, the brain glands increase their secretory activity. Carey called this the period of man, unique to each person according to their natal chart. During this temporal window, what he called the psychophysical seed begins its formation in the claustrum, a thin layer of grey matter near the center of the brain. This seed is neither sperm nor ovum, although it contains the generative potential of both. Medieval alchemists called it mercury of the philosophers, not the metal, but a volatile substance that could be fixed through specific processes. Paracelsus described it as mummy, the vital essence that preserves the body from decomposition. Tantric texts refer to it as bindu, the drop of concentrated consciousness that contains all human potential. The descent of this substance through the spinal cord follows a precise script. First, it accumulates in the region of the pituitary, where it mixes with hormonal secretions that determine its properties. If the individual is in a state of mental agitation, sexual excess, or alcoholic intoxication during this period, the chemistry of the mixture changes drastically. Carey was categorical. Alcohol and acids produced by intestinal fermentation literally cut the molecular bonds between the oil and the mineral salts, destroying their regenerative potential. No drunkard shall inherit the kingdom of heaven was not a moral warning. It was a biochemical impossibility. After 2.5 days in the brain region, the period that the Gospels allegorized as Jesus at 12 years teaching in the temple, the substance begins its downward journey. It travels through the pneumogastric nerve, the 10th cranial nerve that connects the brain to all major organs. During this descent, allegorized as Christ descending to hell, the seed collects information about the state of each organic system, charging itself with the specific vibrational patterns of the individual. In the solar plexus, the Bethlehem of the body, the proper birth of the Christic principle occurs. There, the seed remains for approximately 2.5 days, the same period that the sun takes to transit through a zodiacal sign. During this stay, dietary practices determine its fate. Gluttony produces excessive fermentation, generating internal alcohols that destroy the seed. Moderate fasting and alkaline nutrition preserve its chemical integrity. If properly conserved, the substance undergoes what alchemists called the chemical wedding, a molecular alteration that drastically reduces its density. Carey compared this process to refining crude oil into gasoline, the same base substance, but with an amplified vibrational rate that allows ascension. The seed literally becomes lighter than the surrounding fluids and begins to rise through the column like mercury in a heated thermometer. The ascending return does not follow the same path as the descent. The now refined substance moves through the Ida and Pingala nerves, terminology borrowed from Tantrism but present in all initiatic traditions under different names. These two nerve channels serpentine around the central column, crossing at specific points that correspond to the Indian chakras, the Kabbalistic Sephiroth, and the planets of alchemy. The crucial moment occurs in the medulla oblongata, at the base of the skull, where the two nerves form a real anatomical cross. There, the true crucifixion happens, not death, but amplification. Carey specified, crucify derives from roots that mean to increase 1,000 times in power. When the refined substance passes through this nerve crossing, its vibrational frequency increases exponentially. The preserved Gnostic texts describe a sensation of liquid fire rising through the nape, vision temporarily blinded by internal light, and the sound of 1,000 waters in the ears. The crucified substance then remains 2.5 days in the sepulchre, the cerebellum, where it undergoes the final transformation. There, in the part of the brain that modern medicine recognizes as the coordinator of autonomous functions, the transmuted seed activates dormant centers. Carey cites documented cases of individuals who, after conserving and elevating the seed for multiple cycles, developed capabilities considered supernatural, accelerated tissue regeneration, extraordinary resistance to disease, clairvoyance, and telepathy. On the third day, always this symbolic period of 2.5 days, the substance finally ascends to the pineal gland, the throne of God of mystics, the third eye of Hindus, and the philosopher's stone of alchemists. There it temporarily crystallizes, literally forming microscopic crystals of specific shape that Carey claimed had been photographed in autopsies of advanced yogis and mystics. These crystals would function as transmitter-receivers of higher frequencies of consciousness. The complete cycle, from the birth of the seed to its crystallization in the pineal, takes approximately 1 lunar month. That's why the scriptures speak of Jesus beginning his ministry at 30 years. Not chronological age, but 30 complete cycles of conservation and elevation. That's also why monastic traditions have an obsessive emphasis on chastity and fasting during specific periods of the lunar calendar. Human anatomy reveals itself as a precise map of the Holy Land when one possesses the interpretive key. Jerusalem, the city of peace, is not located at geographical coordinates in the Middle East, but in the cardiorespiratory complex, where the vagus nerve establishes peace between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Carey demonstrated through cartographic overlays that the proportional distance between biblical cities corresponds exactly to the distances between nerve plexuses in the human body. Bethlehem is 9 centimeters from Jerusalem on the map. The solar plexus is 9 vertebrae from the cardiac plexus. Coincidence becomes a mathematical impossibility when each city maintains this exact proportional correspondence. The Mount of Olives, where Christ supposedly prayed before crucifixion, is identified with the 2 olive-shaped brain lobes that secrete the sacred oil. The Garden of Gethsemane, which literally means oil press in Hebrew, is located between these lobes, where intracranial pressure squeezes the glandular secretions. When texts describe Christ sweating blood in Gethsemane, they refer to the medically documented phenomenon where, under extreme glandular activation, capillaries can rupture and mix blood with secretions. Golgotha presents the most compelling evidence. The word unequivocally means skull in Aramaic, not place of the skull, as later translations suggested to justify a geographical location, but simply skull. In the human skull, specifically at the junction of the parietal and occipital bones, a cross-shaped suture forms. There, at the base of the skull, where the medulla oblongata connects to the cerebellum, the Ida and Pingala nerves anatomically cross, forming what anatomists call the decussation of the pyramids. This cruciform structure exists in every human brain. Crucifixion happens monthly in billions of skulls, but only those who have conserved and elevated the seed experience the subsequent resurrection. The nervous system reveals itself as the true tree of life when observed in its totality. Dissected and displayed, it literally forms an inverted arboreal structure. The brain constitutes the upper roots, feeding on the light, electrical impulses, that descends from the cosmos through the fontanelle, the soft spot on top of the skull that remains open in newborns and that Hindus identify as the portal of the 7th chakra. The brainstem and spinal cord form the main trunk of this tree, with its 33 vertebrae corresponding to the 33 years of Christ and the 33 degrees of Freemasonry. The 12 pairs of cranial nerves branch out like main branches, each governing a specific bodily function correlated to the zodiacal signs. The optic nerve corresponds to Aries, the ruler of the head and vision. The vagus nerve, the longest and most complex, corresponds to Virgo, the sign of purification and service. Carey mapped each correspondence, demonstrating that injuries to specific nerves produce symptoms predicted by medieval astrological medicine, not through superstition, but through anatomical knowledge encoded in symbolic language. The symbolism of the fish in early Christianity hides a specific biochemical reality. Carey documented that the sacred secretion, at a certain stage of its maturation process, develops an unmistakable odor of marine fish. This phenomenon occurs when the substance reaches the sacral plexus and begins its alkaline transmutation. Initiates recognized each other by this characteristic odor during conservation periods. The fish was not an arbitrary symbol. It was a literal olfactory description of the internal Christic process. The Greek word for fish, from which early Christian symbols derive, carried multiple layers of meaning. Each letter formed part of a sacred phrase that initiates decoded as instructions for the regeneration process. But even more revealing, when converted to numerical values according to Greek gematria, these letters added up to the exact number of lunar cycles necessary for complete cellular regeneration through systematic conservation of the seed. The early Christians did not choose the fish as a poetic symbol. It was a mathematical and sensory code simultaneously. The multiplications of loaves and fishes in the Gospels encode precise biochemical proportions. 5 loaves represent the 5 main endocrine glands: pineal, pituitary, thyroid, thymus, and adrenals. 2 fish symbolize the 2 primordial secretions, the oil from the pineal and the milk from the pituitary. When texts state that 5,000 were fed, they refer to the approximately 5,000 nerve terminals of the autonomic system that are nourished when these glands function harmoniously. The 12 baskets that remain correspond to the 12 mineral salts that remain in the organism after the transmutation process, each associated with a zodiacal sign and essential for specific bodily functions. Our daily bread refers to the daily production of cerebrospinal fluid, approximately half a liter that the brain secretes and reabsorbs in 6-hour cycles. This fluid, which modern medicine recognizes as essential for the protection and nutrition of the nervous system, was the true manna that fed the body during prolonged fasts. When Christ declares, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven," he identifies with this fluid that literally descends from the brain through the ventricles to the spinal cord. The prohibition of eating bread on the plane of Adam reveals itself as precise technical instruction. Adam, Adamah in Hebrew, means red earth, a reference to the root plexus, the lower region of the body dominated by terrestrial impulses. To consume the sacred substance at this level means to waste it in excessive sexual activity or gluttonous digestion. The bread must be raised, a technical term for the refinement process that occurs when the substance crosses the solar plexus without being degraded by intestinal fermentation. The cerebellum emerges as the most misunderstood organ by exoteric interpretation of the scriptures. Its distinctly heart-shaped format led ancient anatomists to call it the upper heart. When biblical texts state, "As a man thinks in his heart, so is he," they refer to the cerebellum, not the cardiac muscle. In ancient Greek and Hebrew, the organ that pumps blood was simply called divider or pump, mechanical terms without spiritual connotation. The true heart, where higher thoughts and emotions reside, is located in the skull, protected by bone, not exposed in the chest. The cerebellum divides anatomically into 2 hemispheres that the Gnostics called the 2 hearts of man. The upper hemisphere governs transcendent faculties, deep intuition, perception beyond the 5 senses, and access to memories that transcend personal experience. The lower hemisphere regulates survival functions, digestion, reproduction, and instinctive responses to danger. Between them, a vermiform structure called the cerebellar vermis functions as a mediator between higher and lower impulses. The apocalyptic texts that mention the worm that does not die refer to this structure that maintains the continuity of consciousness even during the processes of death and cellular regeneration that constantly occur in the organism. The 300 years of Gnostic Christianity that preceded Nicaea witnessed a silent battle between two irreconcilable visions of salvation. On one side, initiatic communities preserved somatic knowledge, gathering secretly to practice the cycles of conservation and regeneration. On the other hand, an emerging hierarchy sought to consolidate power through doctrinal centralization. The decisive moment arrived in May of 325, when the emperor, who had boiled his own wife in oil, convened an assembly that would determine the spiritual future of the West. Of the 318 bishops summoned to Nicaea, only 220 attended. The records preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea reveal the embarrassing spectacle: bishops illiterate in Greek debating texts they couldn't read, confusing elementary biblical characters, and throwing punches over theological divergences. The debate about the nature of angels exposes the depth of incomprehension. For days, they discussed whether celestial beings needed wings to fly. The minority argued that Jacob's ladder proved that angels didn't need wings. By a margin of only 3 votes, it was established that angels possessed wings. No participant understood that angel derived from the Greek angelos, meaning messenger, the nerve impulses that transmit information through the spinal column. Jacob's ladder represented the 33 vertebrae through which these messengers ascend and descend. The very name Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew, derives from Akev, heel, alluding to the ancestral symbol of the Ouroboros, the eternal cycle where end and beginning meet, just as the coccyx meets the skull through the column. Constantine's biography illuminates his motivations. Helena, his mother, maintained links with Gnostic communities that preserved the anatomical interpretation of the scriptures. When she refused to abandon these teachings, Constantine ordered her execution. His wife Fausta was discovered with Essene manuscripts that detailed the processes of seed conservation. The punishment: immersion in boiling oil until death. Pagan priests warned Constantine that crimes of this magnitude would require countless incarnations of suffering for expiation. He desperately sought a loophole in the cosmic law of cause and effect. The solution emerged through voting: transform physiological symbols into historical characters. If Christ were a real person who died for the sins of humanity, not an internal process that each individual must operate, then it would be enough to believe to obtain salvation. By a narrow majority, it was established that Jesus of Nazareth had physically existed, died on the cross, and resurrected on the 3rd day. Bishops who protested, affirming that Christ was an eternal principle, not a mortal man, were silenced. Some disappeared permanently. The calendrical manipulation implemented after Nicaea constitutes the clearest proof of systematic fraud. The original Roman calendar began in March, aligned with the vernal equinox. The evidence remains fossilized in language itself. September means 7th month, October 8th, November 9th, December 10th. Constantine shifted the beginning of the year to January, breaking the millennial synchronization between celestial and terrestrial cycles. More seriously, he decreed that the moon entered the zodiacal signs 2.5 days before the real astronomical movement. This desynchronization specifically sabotaged the ability to identify the period of man, the critical monthly days when each individual should conserve their seed. Billions would consult horoscopes based on the falsified calendar, systematically missing their regeneration windows. Ecclesiastical almanacs, to this day, perpetuate this astronomical lie. Anyone with a telescope can verify. The moon enters each sign 2.5 days after the date published by the Church. The transformation of the sacraments reveals deliberate reverse engineering. The original baptism, bapto in Greek, described the chemical reaction between the seed and spinal fluid, producing a substance with superior properties. Rome transformed this into a sprinkling of holy water. Confirmation originally marked the first successful conservation at puberty, when the youth learned to control their vital fluids. It became an empty ceremony for 7-year-old children. Communion, celebration of the internal transmutation of bodily bread and wine, degenerated into literal ingestion of wheat and alcohol, precisely the substances that Carey identified as destroyers of the sacred seed. Clerical celibacy exemplifies partial knowledge perverted into destructive dogma. Early priests knew that wasting the seed prevented illumination, but without understanding the lunar cycles of conservation, they imposed perpetual abstinence. Result documented in Vatican archives that Carey himself examined. Generations of mentally disturbed clerics, many falling into perversions that the Church systematically covered up. True chastity, conservation during specific periods, was replaced by permanent, unnatural suppression. Confession replaced self-knowledge. Instead of each practitioner observing how their habits destroy or preserve the seed, a system was created where arbitrary sins are confessed to intermediaries. Monetary tithing replaced the energetic tenth, the 10th part of vital force that should be elevated to the higher brain. Paying gold became a convenient substitute for the internal work of transmutation. The historical consequences form a catalogue of atrocities. Crusaders massacred thousands, seeking to liberate a geographical Jerusalem, while the true Jerusalem, the cardiac center, remained unexplored in their own chests. The Inquisition burned alive those who dared suggest that the kingdom of God was within man. Religious wars devastated continents, disputing interpretations of symbols whose meanings everyone had forgotten. Sacred architecture itself suffered inversion. Ancient temples, from Karnak to Angkor Wat, were built as maps of the human body, with chambers corresponding to organs and corridors mapping meridians. The initiate navigated inward, exploring their sacred anatomy. Gothic cathedrals point towers toward an external sky, directing worship outward, upward, and away from the internal temple where God truly resides. Paradoxically, modern science inherited the same blindness it rejected in religion. Neurologists map the nervous system without recognizing the tree of life. Endocrinologists analyze glandular secretions, ignoring that they manipulate the liquid Christ in their test tubes. Medicine fragmented knowledge into specializations that prevent the holistic vision necessary to perceive the body as an integrated system of sacred processes. The accumulated result after 17 centuries, an entire civilization alienated from its innate spiritual technology, searching in external temples for what circulates in its own blood, paying intermediaries to access what the body offers freely, fearing a death that could be transcended through understanding the regenerative processes already operating in each cell. Millions of people kneel weekly before altars, ingest dead symbols, recite prayers in languages they don't understand, hoping for salvation from a distant God, while the true divine process rots unexplored in their own spinal cords. 17 centuries separate you from the last time this knowledge circulated openly. During this period, approximately 60 billion human beings were born, lived and died, searching externally for a salvation that pulsed in their own spinal cords. Each of them produced, every 29.5 days, the same sacred secretion that could have regenerated them cellularly. Each systematically wasted this substance, dying from diseases their own body had the capacity to heal, aging when they could have renewed themselves, remaining in darkness when they carried the light in their pineal glands. George Carey documented a devastating parallel between the teachings of institutional Christianity and the original knowledge preserved by the Gnostics. The Antichrist, not a person, but the system that inverted the Christic message, teaches that Christ was a historical man born of a woman 2,000 years ago. The suppressed knowledge states, "Behold, I am with you always." The Christic principle operates continuously in each organism. The Church preaches that we must die to reach the kingdom of heaven. The original texts declare, "He who believes shall never die." Believing meaning to practice, to operate, to conserve. Rome insists that only Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit. The Gnostics preserved, "Know ye not that the Holy Spirit dwells in you?" Each monthly conception of the seed is the work of the same creative principle. The most compromising evidence resides in the very scriptures that the Church canonized without understanding. John chapter 4, verses 2 and 3 explicitly state that Jesus Christ came in flesh, not as flesh, but in flesh, within the flesh, as a carnal process. The original Greek text is even more specific. Christ is present in the flesh of every human being. Paul, writing to the Galatians, declares, "Christ in you, the hope of glory. Not Christ for you or Christ by you, but Christ in you, literally, physiologically, anatomically." Observe the world that the Antichrist built. Hospitals are overflowing with the sick who could regenerate themselves. Asylums filled with minds that lost connection with their own sacred oil. Cemeteries are expanding to accommodate bodies that died decades before they were necessary. Pharmacies selling chemical substitutes for substances the organism itself produces. Therapists treating depressions caused by the systematic destruction of the seed through excesses that society itself promotes. Churches collecting tithes from faithful who beg an external God for healing that their own bodies are already trying to accomplish. Carey asked his readers, "Who is the Antichrist? Look at a world in ruins. Does a good tree produce bad fruits?" The combatants in the world wars he witnessed prayed to the same imaginary God in the desert of their own ignorance, asking for victory and peace while the true Christ rotted unexplored in their spinal columns. 100 years later, nothing has changed. Wars continue to be fought in the name of different interpretations of the same misunderstood symbol. What Carey discovered was not an esoteric theory or an alternative interpretation of the scriptures. It was a precise anatomical map, an operating manual for the human body that was deliberately hidden. When he overlaid maps of the Holy Land on diagrams of the nervous system, the correspondences were too exact to be a coincidence. When he traced etymologies of biblical terms to their Greek and Hebrew roots, he found literal descriptions of physiological processes, not poetic metaphors. The question that remains unanswered for 17 centuries: why was this knowledge suppressed with such violence? Carey's answer is simple and disturbing. Because a population that understands it carries within itself the complete equipment for regeneration and illumination, doesn't need intermediaries, doesn't pay tithes, and doesn't blindly obey authorities who claim to hold the keys to the kingdom. A human being conscious of their internal Christic potential is impossible to control through promises of future salvation or threats of eternal damnation. The preserved Essene manuscripts, the Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, and the medieval alchemical treatises all converge on the same description of the process. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia documented the same journey of the seed through the body. Either there was an impossible global conspiracy spanning all of human history, or these independent observers were documenting a real biological phenomenon that anyone can verify for themselves. Skepticism is understandable. Accepting that Christianity was inverted in its fundamental meaning requires abandoning 2,000 years of cultural conditioning. Recognizing that each Mass, each communion, and each prayer directed to an external God was wasted energy that could have been invested in understanding internal processes causes a cognitive dissonance that the mind resists processing. But consider the alternative that Carey proposes, not abandonment of spirituality, but its deepening through understanding its physiological basis. Not denial of the sacred, but its precise location in the temple of the body itself. Not rejection of Christ, but recognition that the Christic principle operates in every living organism, awaiting only consciousness and cooperation to manifest its regenerative effects. The signs that Christ said would follow those who believe: healing by touch, immunity to poisons, and resurrection of the dead, were not metaphorical promises about supernatural powers. They were literal descriptions of what happens when the sacred oil is consistently conserved and elevated. Carey documented cases of individuals who, following this knowledge, developed exactly these capacities, not by external miracle, but by activation of latent biochemical potentials in each cell. The final question that each person must confront: if this knowledge exists, if the process is real, if the body really produces monthly a substance capable of complete cellular regeneration, how much of this substance have you already wasted? How many cycles have passed unnoticed while you searched in external temples for what circulated in your veins? How many opportunities for renewal were lost in rituals that replaced real practice with empty symbol? There is no comforting answer to these questions. But there is an inescapable fact: the next lunar cycle approaches. In approximately 29 days, your body will produce new seed, secrete new oil, and initiate a new potential process of regeneration. What you will do with this knowledge is a choice that no institution, no dogma, and no authority can make for you. Carey concluded his writings with a direct appeal. Return to the God and Christ within you, O deluded ones, and the trumpets will sound truce along the iron front of war, and the redeemed of the Lord will return to Zion with songs and everlasting joy on their faces. Zion is not a geographical place. It is the state of consciousness achieved when the sacred oil completes its journey and crystallizes in the pineal gland. All change begins with understanding your role as co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We have developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and get immediate access, click on the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me,"